Hello, Professor. My name is Vince, and with me is group number 2 with Nagar, Lisa, Carmelina, and Sailor presenting about Black, Indigenous, and people of color, otherwise known as BIPOC justice. Racial injustice is constructed by false assumptions about people and their social value, deeply embedded by those in power to justify the divergence in worldwide resources. This type of injustice manifests in various ways. For the most part, it allows some groups of people to view themselves, their culture, religion, and their ways of life as superior to others. It is also a strategized tactic to maintain multiple positions in forms of political, sociocultural, and economic power. Black, Indigenous, and other people of color all share a past of some kind of injustice. From colonization, slavery, to complete dominance and dehumanization of a whole group of people, BIPOC communities have suffered through it all and fought for their right to live in this world as human beings. In 2021, things may seem to get better, but BIPOC communities continue to face injustice and are still currently fighting the after effects of the past, including the right to live and the right to be treated fairly. In this presentation, our group will tackle the current nature of justice faced by BIPOC communities in the world and within the Canadian context by going through the main issues involved in BIPOC justice, the effectiveness of the measures used to reduce oppression and inequalities faced by BIPOC communities, the forces standing in the way of achieving greater action to address these injustices, and how BIPOC justice interacts with other global issues.
Hello everyone, my name is Negar. I'm going to explain that what issues have been created by systematic racism. The first issue is related to the unequal employment position. This means that for people of color, finding the right position based on their education, skills, and experiences is harder than white race. In fact, managerial and professional occupations are less accessible for them with the same or higher educational background compared with white people, which lead to unequal employment position. Moreover, the unemployment rates for people of color has increased by 5.2%, which is 2.8% for white race during and after the Great Recession. And also people of color get paid less than their white colleagues. The second issue is related to the health condition. This indicates that systematic racism has caused implicit bias, which has provided unequal treatment to people of color over the time. In this way, the main point that causes a poor health condition is related to social factors such as policies and unstable housing that lead to get lower quality care, which has negative impacts on people of color lives. The third issue is for demanding justice. Because of race discrimination, people of color are under suspicion for certain types of crimes such as drug involvement at the point of arresting. As a result, the biased policies that are enforced by law have created structural injustice. As we have seen by continued unlawful engagement by police with the public, including the tragic killing of unarmed Black people by law enforcement officers, their relations continue to reflect bias within the criminal legal system. Therefore, this creates a situation in which people of color do not meet equal justice under the law. The last issue is related to social participation. The social participation can include voting, housing, bank loan, and sport activities that people of color are involved in as being part of the society. In fact, report shows that people of color experiencing racial discrimination 3 times more than white people when trying to vote or participate in politics. Moreover, housing is challenging for them because the value of people of color's home is below the value of their white neighbor's home. And also they have been mostly denied conventional bank and mortgage loans at rates far higher than white people. Moreover, in sport activities, it has been noticed that people of color are not considered for general managers positions for the most of sport teams, which provides an injustice regarding people of color. For instance, there are 32 head coaches in the NFL, but only 4 of them are recognized as people of color. 3 are Black and 1 is Hispanic head coach. In the end, based on mentioned points, injustices that people of color face have been involved with the fighting for the basic social rights such as the need for employment, health, justice, proper house financing, and even sport game play. Thank you.
Effectiveness of the current measures. In Ontario, the Anti-Racism Act was created in 2017. The Anti-Racism Strategic Plan was released following the Act The plan's guiding principles are systemic focus, a whole government collective impact approach, target universalism, distinctiveness and intersectionality of racism, inclusive process, transparency, evidence-based approach, and sustainability. In 2018, the Ontario government made funding cuts to the Anti-Racism Act, and Laura May Lindo, the Kitchener Centre NDP representative, said the cuts that occurred portrayed a message that racialized and Indigenous people in Ontario didn't matter. So the Anti-Racism Act, it doesn't seem as effective due to these budget cuts, seeing that it is making the topic of racism against racialized people and Indigenous people don't matter in the government's eyes. For Canada as a whole, the federal government created an anti-racism strategy in 2019. This 3-year plan is focused on engaging communities and Indigenous people, empowering the communities and Indigenous people by introducing new anti-racism action programs, enhanced support, encouraging innovation, and building awareness by providing public education, and addressing the hate crimes and online hate speech. Asian Canadians have seen flaws in the strategy and have called for improvements due to the surge of anti-Asian racism at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. Advocates have pointed out that the strategy covers every racialized population and Indigenous people, but not anti-Asian racism. Also, advocates have stated that the funding needs to be permanent.
Hi, I'm Carmelina, and I'm going to speak on the active barriers that work against BIPOC justice. The first one being state-sponsored oppression, which is a term that explains how the Crown has used as legislation in order to justify taking Indigenous land and attempting to assimilate their culture for over 150 years. The state does this through numbered treaties, the Constitution, and the Indian Act, which includes the residential school system. We have put these people so far behind that they need to work very hard to rebuild their communities and things that we've taken away from them. The second one being abandonment and neglect. Since there has been years of BIPOC communities, they are still less well off than other Canadians and experience much abandonment from our community, other civilians, and especially the justice system. For example, like we spoke in class, the homicide rate for Indigenous women in Canada was almost 6 times higher than the homicide rate for non-Indigenous women, and there's over 106 unsolved homicide cases for coming from that community. The third active barrier would be discrimination, as BIPOC individuals experience a very high amount compared to other citizens, and it's experienced through the legislation. As it states, many of the normal acts are illegal. Many communities are still evicted from their land and stripped of their natural resources. They are neglected and experience hate crimes by other civilians. Indigenous are also excluded from many political forums and find it very hard to defend themselves, and many laws protecting them are not really enforced. The last one being systemic racism, which means people of color and face this in the workplace, the school system, and the justice system in their everyday lives, and these people on average are have a much lower well-being than other individuals. The system often denies Black individuals access to loans, high income positions, and ownership, but then denies them of getting better jobs because they come from low income ones, creating a vicious low income cycle bracket. These individuals are often overlooked and don't receive the same services, meaning they turn to drug use and poor mental health. They then give these people a reputation and blame them.
Black, Indigenous, and people of color face injustices daily due to being racial minorities. While losing privileges based on skin color and ethnic features, this can be linked to other global justice issues, such as gender inequality, LGBTQ+ inequality, colonialism, and even climate justice. For example, Black women experience both a race and gender wage gap that reflects the intersectional reality of their daily lives. The sharpest earnings differences are between Black women and white men, who are benchmarked as the highest earners. But Black women also experience wage disparities when compared with white women and Black men. Intersectionality is defined as the interconnected nature of social categorizations such as race, class, and gender, creating discrimination and disadvantages. Another good example is how climate change disproportionately impacts BIPOC communities in Canada and around the world. Communities that generally contribute less to greenhouse gas emissions and lack the resources that wealthy, predominantly white communities have to adapt to climate change. On top of that, BIPOC voices are still largely absent from the boardrooms and meeting tables where decisions that affect their lives are made. In conclusion, to understand BIPOC justice is a good way to dismantle white supremacy and undo racism.
You can't undo racism.
To work towards a better world, we must understand our privileges and our differences. Overall, it is important to stand in solidarity with Black, Indigenous, and people of color.